Welcome to Mind Shield. We protect the mind and pursue the truth. Let's get started.
That quote really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. When we're up against something complex, something that feels invisible, maybe even powerful, our first instinct can be to fill in the gaps with fear or, just assume it's magic. But what we actually need is a vocabulary. We need the right words.
So, welcome to Mind Shield. This season, we are diving deep into technical literacy. And why are we doing that? Because to get through a world that's just full of invisible signals and really confusing claims, you don't need an engineering degree. You just need a toolkit, and that's what we're here to build together. The knowledge to face these complex topics with clarity and with confidence.
So welcome back. Our goal for this season is very, very specific. We want to learn just enough of the technical reality so that we can stop feeling helpless. But, and this is just as important, we have to do it without turning into some kind of fear machine that sees a threat around every single corner. It's a bit of a tightrope walk, right? Learning to be aware without letting all that awareness turn into constant anxiety. That's the balance we're shooting for.
To help us walk that tightrope, we're going to use a simple but really powerful framework for everything we talk about. I want you to think of it like 3 buckets. Our first bucket is documented. This is the public record, the established science, the stuff we can all look up and verify. The second bucket is reported. This is human testimony, personal experiences. And we treat this as real data, something that needs a real explanation. And our third bucket is hypothesis. This is where we get to explore what's technically plausible and, this is the key part, testable. This framework is going to keep us grounded.
Okay, so here's the roadmap for today. We're going to start by building our basic toolkit in the signal and the noise. Then we'll put that toolkit to work, sorting through the documented reality and listening to the human experience. From there, we'll explore the really fascinating bridge between the two in plausible pathways. And finally, we'll wrap up by talking about how to use all of this to stay calm and vigilant. All right, let's just dive right in. Part 1 is all about building our vocabulary. We're going to demystify these basic terms that get thrown around all the time so they stop sounding like magic and start sounding like what they actually are, just measurable properties of the physical world.
First up, frequency. All frequency is a measurement of how fast something oscillates, how fast it vibrates. We measure it in hertz. The light coming from your screen, the sound of my voice, the signal going to your phone, everything has a frequency. Now, I want you to burn this next part into your brain because it's probably the biggest misconception out there. Higher frequency does not automatically mean more dangerous. That idea is a total myth, and it gets in the way of understanding pretty much everything else.
Which brings us to power. Power is simply the amount of energy being transmitted. We measure it in watts. Think of it as the oomph behind the signal. And here's the thing. In almost every single real-world situation, the power of a signal matters way more than its frequency when you're talking about its potential to actually have an effect on something.
Okay, just let this slide sink in for a second, because if you only take one single technical idea away from this whole explainer, I want it to be this one. Frequency does not equal power. They are not the same thing. You can have a super high frequency signal with almost no power, like the light from a tiny little LED, and it's completely harmless. And you can have a lower frequency signal with a ton of power, like the current in a high voltage line, and that is obviously incredibly dangerous. They're 2 totally separate things.
All right, let's just round out our toolkit with 3 more quick concepts. First, wavelength. That's just the physical size of the wave itself. Longer waves can kind of bend around objects. Shorter waves are much more easily blocked. Next up, modulation. Now this is the clever part. It's how we actually put information onto a wave. Think of it like adding a really complex rhythm to a simple drum beat. And finally, an antenna. Forget all the sci-fi stuff. An antenna is just a specifically shaped tool for sending or receiving that energy. It's a transducer. It's not a magic wand.
Okay, so now that we have our vocabulary, let's move into our first bucket, documented reality. This is the world as it's governed by the laws of physics and, human regulations. This is the world of constraints.
In the world that most of us live in, signals are actually pretty predictable. They're engineered to do very specific and, frankly, kind of boring jobs, all within really strict limits. They connect our phones, they link up our Wi-Fi, they guide airplanes, and they carry data. These systems work precisely because they are built around limitations. Now, this slide. This is your new reality check toolkit. These are the constraints that any real-world energy system has to obey, period. Signal strength, it plummets with distance. The further away you are, the weaker it gets. Simple as that. Line of sight matters. Walls, trees, even heavy rain can get in the way. To create a big effect, you need a big and usually very noticeable power source. Hitting a small moving target with a beam is incredibly hard. And finally, a strong, focused energy beam, well, it isn't subtle. It can be detected.
And this right here brings us to the key question. This is the question that flips the script. It moves you from just being a passive listener to an active investigator. The next time you hear any claim about some signal with, seemingly magical powers, you can now just calmly ask, okay, which one of those physical constraints did it overcome? And how, specifically, did it do that?
So now we're going to move to our second bucket. And this is where we really have to shift our perspective. We are not here to judge. We are not here to dismiss. We are here to listen and to document the patterns in what people say they're experiencing, treating that testimony as a serious set of phenomena that absolutely deserves a rigorous explanation. Across thousands and thousands of reports, certain patterns just keep emerging again and again. People describe sensations that feel really localized, like to just one part of their head or their body. They talk about hearing sounds, sometimes even voices, that nobody else can hear and that have no external source. And they report disruptions that seem to be tied or synchronized to specific places or times. These are the recurring data points.
And what's so fascinating is that these reports, they're not new, not at all. In fact, they echo descriptions from decades ago. All the way back in 1961, the researcher Alan Frey, in his groundbreaking work, documented subjects reporting sensations from pulsed microwaves. He wrote that they described a severe buffeting of the head and a pins and needles tingling sensation. Now, these are physical descriptions from a controlled scientific setting that sound a lot like the subjective reports of today.
And more recently, communities of people who identify as targeted individuals have documented their experiences in a lot of detail. They describe things like intense, sudden muscle contractions or really strong sensations of heating, burning, or itching on their skin. The consistency in these descriptions across different people in different places, that consistency is in itself a really significant piece of data. So we have two things on the table. We have the hard, established rules of physics, and we have this very consistent pattern of human experience. So the big question is, can we build a bridge between them? Is there a technically plausible way, using the physics that we know, to actually explain what so many people are reporting? And that leads us to our third and final bucket, plausible pathways. Now let's be super clear here. This is where we explore testable hypotheses. We are not saying these things are happening. We are examining documented scientific phenomena that could potentially explain the reported experiences. This is about what's possible. So let's start with one of the most well-documented phenomena out there, the microwave auditory effect, sometimes called the Frey effect. The mechanism is actually surprisingly straightforward. A beam of pulsed microwaves hits the head. Each one of those little pulses deposits a tiny bit of energy, which causes a microscopic but very rapid thermal expansion in the tissue. This expansion creates a minuscule pressure wave, basically an acoustic shock wave, that travels through your skull right to your inner ear. Your cochlea picks up that pressure wave and interprets it just like it would any other sound. The head itself literally becomes a speaker. And look, the key thing to get from this timeline is that this is not some fringe internet theory. This is a known effect with a long history of scientific and military interest. It started with radar operators hearing clicks during World War II. Alan Frey proved it scientifically in '61. By 1974, researchers at Walter Reed were transmitting actual recognizable words. A patent for a hearing system was granted in '89. And as recently as 2003, the U.S. Navy was actively trying to weaponize this effect for crowd control under the project named Medusa. This is all part of the documented record. This table is a great side-by-side comparison of how different signals can produce wildly different effects. On one side, you've got the active denial system, or ADS. It uses a very high frequency, 95 gigahertz, which only penetrates the very top layer of your skin. The effect? An intense burning sensation designed to make people back away. It's a documented non-lethal weapon. But then you have a project like Medusa. It used a much lower microwave frequency, maybe 1 to 3 gigahertz, which penetrates deeper into the head to create that auditory effect. Same principle, directed energy, but totally different parameters for a completely different outcome. So, we've built our vocabulary, we've walked through our 3 buckets, documented, reported, and hypothesis. But how do we actually use this? This next section is all about turning that knowledge from just abstract theory into a practical framework that you can use for calm, clear-headed action. This right here is your new superpower. It's a simple set of 3 questions you can apply to any claim you hear or any experience you have. First,
what is the frequency? That tells you how the signal might interact with things and how well it penetrates materials. Second, what's the power level? That tells you about the intensity and its potential to have a real effect. And third, what's the delivery path? Where is it coming from? What's between the source and the target? If you just ask these 3 questions, you start to cut right through the fear and the confusion. You start thinking like an analyst.
And to put that into practice, here's a little evidence task. In a notebook or just a file on your computer, create a simple signal literacy card just like this one. It lists all the key concepts we've talked about. The next time you encounter an incident, maybe you read about it, maybe you experience something yourself, just try to write one single sentence for each of these categories. Now, this exercise isn't about finding some smoking gun. It's about training your mind to think with discipline and clarity, to move from "I feel a weird vibe" to "I am observing a phenomenon with these specific describable characteristics."
And that brings us to our final section for today, the watch. This is all about adopting a long-term mindset of wisdom and patience and resilience, which is so much more sustainable than either constant panic or total denial.
This really brings us to the mindset that we need to carry forward, and it's summed up perfectly in this piece of ancient advice from Proverbs: get wisdom. In this specific context, let's define wisdom as the active refusal of 2 extremes. It's refusing to panic and jump to conclusions without evidence, and it's also refusing to deny the possibility of things that we just don't understand yet. Wisdom is the discipline to stay right in that uncomfortable middle ground, guided by evidence and clear thinking.
And this is a really, really important idea. When you apply those 3 questions, your new superpower, and you come up empty, it doesn't mean the claim is debunked. It means the claim is underdetermined. It means we don't have enough information yet. And learning to confidently say, "I don't know yet," is one of the most powerful and intellectually honest positions you can possibly take. So today, we've laid a really important foundation of signal basics. But it opens up a much deeper question. How can energy from the outside world interact with our immediate environment, our homes, our cars, our bodies, in ways that can feel intensely personal but are so hard to measure and even harder to prove? That's the interaction problem. And that's exactly what we'll be exploring next time.